Hello, everyone. Welcome to April National Poetry Month. I'm Daniel Smith, and I'm talking to you from the hills of southwestern Wisconsin. And I'm very pleased to be joined by my son, Austin Smith, who's joining us from the remote hills of California. Austin?
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Dad. It's good to see you. As my dad just said, I'm currently staying out on a farm in Central California, and I'm excited to join my dad today and to read some poems and to talk about our shared journey as poets. And happy National Poetry Month to everyone, and thank you so much for joining this event. We really appreciate it.
And Austin and I would like to thank Arcadia Books for hosting us. We also would like to thank Arcadia Books for just being there, because that bookstore has meant so much to my wife Cheryl and I in the times that we have lived in, years we have lived in southwestern Wisconsin. And Austin enjoys it very much when he's in the Midwest going there as well. So thank you, Nancy. Thank you for the whole wonderful team for all your friendship and support. I'm going to talk a little bit about Austin because he doesn't like to talk about himself. I don't like to talk about myself, so he can talk about me. But as the father in this grouping here, I'll go first. Austin Cheryl and I raised Austin with his two brothers on a family dairy farm in northwestern Illinois, where, because we were both avid readers and lovers of poetry, and I had written poetry for most of my life, Austin got the gene and has greatly expanded beyond that to the point where he is an internationally respected and well-known poet, fiction writer, and nonfiction writer. Former Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford. He now is a Jones Lecturer at Stanford, teaching multiple courses in literature and creative writing. His poems, short stories, and essays have appeared in the world's leading literary magazines, including the Paris Review, the New Yorker, Poetry Magazine. If I were to name all the awards and fellowships and honors that Austin has received, we would not have time to get to the poems. So I recommend that you visit his website, austinrobertsmith.com. And now I'll turn it over to Austin, and it's your chance to embarrass me.
Thanks, Dad. Well, you're right. I don't like to talk about myself, and we're typical humble Midwesterners. My dad is an amazing poet whose extraordinary volume of poems about to come out later this spring or early this summer, called Ancestral. And I think that title really epitomizes the themes that my dad and myself that we write about. The importance of connection to family and to place, and my dad's poems drawing upon his long experience as a dairy farmer, and also his work with distressed farmers through the Farm Crisis Center in Wisconsin, and all the way through to experiences that he and my mom have had living in southwestern Wisconsin in a beautiful log cabin, which you can see there in the background. And I'm really, really excited for my dad's collection to come out. When I was a kid, he had a collection called Homeland that was published, I believe, in 1997. So I would have been 15. And I was thinking today and preparing for this reading about the first poetry reading I saw my dad give at the Freeport Art Museum. And it was a transformative experience for me as a kid to see language used and utilized in the way my dad used it. And it did transfer something to me, a desire to become a poet myself. And so I might be sitting here under this tree, but I wouldn't be sitting here under this tree as a poet were it not for my dad's work. And as I think you'll hear when we start reading, we really speak to one another in our poems, and it's a way of communicating with one another and to those we love, and even to those we don't know. So it's just a lovely thing to have a father who's a poet and has been so supportive of my work. And I'm really excited to be supportive of this this spring and summer as his book comes out and comes into being. And I hope that you'll all seek a copy of it when it's available. And again, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for my dad. So it's especially, this is a really special reading. Of all the readings I do, this one means quite a great deal more to me. So,
Well, thank
Dad?
you. Thank
Yeah.
you. I failed to mention that Austin has 2 books of poetry out, and along with some chapbooks, but he has his book Almanac came out from Princeton Press in 2013, and his book Flyover Country came out from Princeton Press in 2018. And Arcadia Books has been a great promoter of Austin's work, and we very much appreciate that. Look forward to Ancestral being in print, being in the store, being available from Water's Edge Press, which has been such a wonderful press for me to work with, a Wisconsin-based literary press that I have a great deal of respect for. So we're here to read poetry, and we should get to it. Austin and I talked about maybe we would kind of go back and forth. I'll read a poem, Austin will read a poem. Maybe we discuss a little bit about how those poems came to be, and then we'll read some more, and we'll just have a conversation. And we hope that you find that enjoyable and informative, and that you really enjoy the poetry. So I'll start off with a poem that fitting for this reading, and a poem that is indicative of a lot of the writing that I do and Austin does, centered on a farm, centered within a family, centered on the father-son relationship of farming, sharing of the natural world, and the love of just those special moments that if you don't keep your poetic eye open, you tend to overlook. And this is a poem that I wrote called Northwestern Illinois in June. We want the rain, not the wind, my father would say, as we watch the big storms born of Iowa afternoon heat come across the Mississippi, only to turn north into Wisconsin, showing us their flash of heat lightning like the lighted windows of passing trains. Behind the night sky clearing, opening to stars, as we turn to go in, our footsteps breaking the brittle grass, the oak leaves turned white and upward like a beggar holding an empty bowl. Austin?
I love that poem. I'm glad you started with that one, Dad. And it's those 2 images of the train, lighted train windows, and then the leaves like hands in the upturned bowl image really stick with me. And there are a lot of oaks out here in California. It's one of the things that makes me feel like I'm not so far away from home. And sometimes with a little breeze, I'll see that movement of the leaves that you described in the poem, and it just immediately brings me back to the poem. So it's one of those ways in which poems start to make you, like you said, see the world differently if you have your poetic eye open. Mm-hmm. I was actually thinking about, I knew that you were going to read that poem first, so I thought I would read a poem of mine called The Leaves, but it's not, these are not the leaves of a tree, but the leaves of say a dining room table. And to preface this poem, I guess it has more resonance now, maybe considering the losses with COVID in the last year, but you'll hear when I read the poem that it's really about the importance of family and gathering together, and also mourning the loss of those who are no longer with us. So The Leaves. The leaves lived behind the dining room doors. They only came out when company came out. Dad would lift one end of the table, my brothers and I the other. Then we'd shuffle a few steps backward, pulling the table apart. Turned out that, like the loaves and fishes, the table wasn't finite. We could make it as long as we needed it to be. Did we need 1 leaf, 2 leaves, 3? It depended on who all was coming. I loved the nights we needed all the leaves. They meant there were still too many of us to fit around the leafless table. But I knew one day there'd be no need for them. Then what would we do with the leaves? I thought how it would be better for a few of us to sit at too long a table that had 3 leaves in it and have to raise our voices, than to sit whispering around the leafless one.
I really love that poem, Austin, and I think it is very fitting for today. Yeah, it's an example of, a young boy going through an experience that he later remembers as a young man, and has the capability to work the play on words and to capture something that, even though this is an event that happened early in Austin's life, when we were prepared the dining room table for company, how that comes back in today's world and has whole new significance, whole new power. And power is a great word to use there because it shows the power of poetry. And we are here in National Poetry Month. The power of words to capture a boy's memory and resonate through the rest of his life and expand to things that we've all been dealing with here for the last year. It's truly an exceptional poem. I love that poem. I know that it has been widely recognized as such in the literary world too. So congratulations for that, Austin.
Thanks.
So in 2008, after 55 years of living on the same farm in Illinois, 30 of those years operating that farm as a full-time farmer, Cheryl and I relocated to a small farm in the Driftless area and left the family farm. And you'll see in Ancestral, that is really one of the key themes of having a home place, of loving that home place, but then having the ability, if that's the right word, to move to another place and to love that place as well, to recreate yourself later in life, to find new paths that are equally rewarding, but at the same time, never giving up everything that was so important to you all those years that brought you to this place. When we relocated to this small farm, it fell to me and my immediate family to load up, sort through, move things that were 3 generations deep on the farm in Illinois. And the first poem that I wrote when we relocated to the Driftless area was called Anvil. And it was brought about by unloading the truck when we moved up from Illinois and seeing things in new places, including yourself, seeing new things around you in a new environment. And I'll read Anvil for you now. I've hauled my father's anvil due north, up out of the black Illinois farm ground. He and I together worked decades our home. Set down 60 pounds onto the floor of this old barn, new only to me. All around our bewildered tools hang in the strange light of the cracked window pane, where I stand looking over land not yet home. It is growing late on a late winter's day. At my feet, my father's anvil, his striking song of steel on steel, still hammering home.
I love that poem. I didn't realize that was the first poem you wrote after moving. I think my family, my mom and my brothers and I have all so admired that line about the bewildered tools. I don't think there's been a greater use of the word bewildered in the English language. And just the idea of the bewilderment of tools, which are inanimate, but the personification lends them this personality. But another thing I admire about the poem so much is it really feels like the hammer strikes on an anvil, especially the last line. There's just such a kind of power to the sound of those lines, and still hammering home enacts the what is being described in this beautiful way. You know, I'm sorry, I'm slipping into my creative writing lecturer spiel and analyzing the poem maybe too much, but I just, one thing I admire about your work, Dad, is, you know, conveying emotion via the physical world, and for instance, via tools or via the anvil. There's a great deal of emotion in all of your work, but it's always conveyed to us via the physical world. And so that's something I think I learned from you. It's probably too long a poem for you to read today, but you can seek this out in my dad's book, Ancestral, a great poem about being on the wheat harvest and cutting wheat in the summer heat out west, and just all the characters and the tools and the machinery. And that was something that I think I took away from your work, is realizing the importance of showing the reader the world, and rather than just kind of, you know, wandering into vague emotional territory, really conveying emotion via physical things. So I was kind of choosing the poems I wanted to read today based on the poems I knew my dad would be sharing. So I thought I would share a newer poem that I wrote. It's maybe not as emotionally resonant as Anvil, but it involves not really a tool, but I guess something we use in the garden. This is a poem called The Wheelbarrow. In the beginning, the wheelbarrow wanted 2 wheels, but was denied this request. One was determined to be enough. And anyway, it was told it was being given 2 arms and a profound emptiness, just like its maker. Did it not know what a blessing this was?
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
You know, Austin and I have both been able to use the farm as our laboratory for creating poetry. There's an abundance of images and themes that stem from a farm. Austin mentioned the wheat harvest poem. When I look back at my early work, it was almost exclusively about farming. A summer on the wheat harvest, that I was always very connected, and our family was very, very connected to, you know, a 320-acre farm in northwestern Illinois. But the one thing that I love about your work, Austin, over the years, is how you've used that base, stayed true to that base. You've really expanded your themes, your view of the world. You've traveled widely, internationally. You've studied in, you know, major literary programs such as UC Davis, University of Wisconsin, University of Virginia, and at Stanford. Had the opportunity to work with Tobias Wolff and Joyce Carol Oates and Gregory Orr. And I know that both you and I feel a great deal of indebtedness to the poets we admired. I can still remember when I was 19 years old and first discovered the work of Gary Snyder. And when you think of events that change your life, the first time I read Gary Snyder, I knew he had just changed my life. I didn't even have to wait years to look back at that. I knew that night that I was a different person because of reading Gary Snyder. And over the years, we were very fortunate, Austin and I and the rest of our family, to be located near a community college that had a great reading series. And we were able to host Gary Snyder and Michael Mott and Margaret Gibson and Lucian Strike and so many other wonderful poets for readings at our local community, and have them to the farm. And I know that had a big influence on you, Austin, when you were just a young boy sitting in the room and Gary Snyder was walking around the house. I mean, who gets that opportunity? So maybe you could talk a little bit about, you know, not only Tobias and Joyce and those, but the poets that influenced you as you were growing up.
Yeah. I have very fond memories of the poets who visited us. And I think I was a quite maybe precocious kid. I started writing poems almost immediately after learning. Well, as I said earlier, after hearing my dad read, you know, I just wanted to do that. And when when the poets came, I really felt like whatever their lives were like, I wanted that life. You know, I wanted a life of reading, writing, and community, because I could tell they really loved one another, these poets, and most of them loved one another. And, you know, it's not always true, but I've really sought that out. You know, as my dad mentioned, I've been in a number of programs, and now as a teacher myself, it's just very important to try to honor those who came before you, and then to try to pass on what you've learned to those who follow you. So as a teacher, I'm proud to be able to do that now. But I feel like I'm sort of halfway between still, still learning so much from people like my dad and mentors and that my dad mentioned, like Tobias Wolff, and yet also I have students of my own. So it's kind of a beautiful life, and I'm really glad that I became acquainted with poetry and poets at such a young age, because when I went to graduate school, I realized, like my dad just said, it wasn't that common to have a bunch of collections of poetry in the house, or to have a dad who's a poet or a mom who's a poet, or to meet poets at that age. So I think I got off to a good start, and it wasn't my doing. I was just fortunate. Yeah. And so I have very fond memories of those times. And I continue to stay in touch with a lot of the people that I met, even when I was quite young, including Gary Snyder. So.
And I think you're mentioning the kindness, you know, if I had to make a list of some of the kindest, most generous, helpful people that I've met in any walk of life, the Gary Snyders, Lucian Strikes, Tobias Wolff, those types of people. It's been an honor to have ever even met them in person, but it's definitely helped both of our work over the years under their stewardship. I had almost a 25-year correspondence with Michael Mott, the author of The Seven Mountains of Thomas Merton, and a marvelous poet who recently passed away. You know, just analyzing my poem, suggesting a comma be moved, and I you know, or I use a different word here, or break a stanza there, and I was always amazed that this internationally known writer would care, that he would take the time to write that back to me. And it's really the core of not only mentorship and a kind of an apprenticeship, but it's the core of friendship, you know, to share that. Why don't you go ahead, Austin, and read, and then I'll follow you this time.
Okay. So I'm reading from, I think, a new collection of mine that is called Make Believe, and it's a little different from some of the poems I've written in the past. It's maybe not so focused on the Midwest as other of my poems have been. I'm not sure why that is. My dad mentioned I've spent a lot of time away from the Midwest, and that hence I'm out here in California right now. Though I still spend a part of the year back in Illinois. Some of these new poems that I'm writing have just been coming from just a different place, and I don't know why that is, but this poem I wrote pretty recently when I woke up here one morning and it was extremely foggy, and I just started meditating upon all the ways in which you could see fog as maybe metaphorical or symbolic of something larger. So kind of going with the idea of my dad's great poem about the anvil, trying to use fog here and find its other resonances. So anyway, this poem is called Fog. We woke late. The day ought to have begun, but there was a fog. Maybe you could see 10 yards in the low places, less. All day we waited for it to burn off, like someone you wished would stop talking, but it never did. And the next morning, it was there again, having never gone, like a raw grief awoken to. And so we lived, not as if in a fog, but in one, impenetrable, as theological logic of the suicide, or the general malaise a culture will fall into, so that people see only what is right before their eyes. The thing is, these sorts of fogs only lift when everyone has given up hope that they will, so that the light once longed for so desperately seems harsh and wrong.
It's such a timely poem and such a beautiful image of, that really transcends to, the times that we're living in. I think Austin's probably, well, I know he's the hardest working writer I know of. He works like a craftsman. He works very, very diligently at his words, and he writes a tremendous amount. And it's been a joy to see his perspective on the world and his, as he matures as a person and a writer, really be able to develop those themes. So I'm very excited about this new book. One of the great things about a father and son both being interested in writing is, we help each other. And that's one of the joys of my life. Austin and I share many, many things together. We love sports. His great essay about our first and only attendance of a Green Bay Packer football game appeared as an essay in Harper's Magazine. You think the essay is about football till you read it, then it really is about much, much more than football. So I recommend getting a hold of that if you can, because it's just such an enjoyable read. Beyond sports, we love the outdoors, canoeing. Austin's a great fly fisherman, which I haven't taken up yet, but he's got me, certainly has perked my interest in that. His poem with the fog and the poem that I'm about to read, I think both remind me of something the great writer Jim Harrison once said, where he said that if you're not writing, you don't have your poet's eye open. You're going through the world, and you're going through the world on everyday man on the street vision of the world. Okay, there's a stoplight or there's a store over here or something like that, and that's what you're seeing. Writers need to see the world through their poet's eye, and then there's always something to write about. Like Austin just wrote about the fog. The poem I'm going to read to you now is a poem that, unfortunately, I think we all probably feel in today's very volatile world. And it came to me one morning while watching the evening. It came to me one evening while watching the evening news, where a person was referring back to that morning, and she had lost her home in the wildfires in California. And in the interview, she said she looked back and there was nothing but devastation, smoking embers, just the chimneys standing there. And she said, just this morning, it was all here. And it made me realize how quickly life can change in a day in so many different ways. And I wrote this poem called The Day. How abruptly change appears, dressed as wildfire leaping the divide, or the armed intruder in the hall, or the drunk driver failing to stop. So the norm is now respite, the blessed day, the day that ends as it began. Everything you love, intact, at peace, safely home. I think that's about all we can ask for these days.
Yeah, that's such an amazing poem, and that you wrote it, even, I believe, not that it mentions COVID, but it feels like it's a poem that can speak to us in any moment. And again, not to like nitpick or to get into the very into a particular image or line, but the idea of the day as dressing itself in fire is just haunting, and how certain days can take the shape of whatever tragedy is occurring in whatever person or family it might be occurring to. And I think it's hard to write topical poems about something that just happened. For instance, maybe the fires in California, without the poem maybe getting a little bit locked in that time, in that moment. But I think the day, it's a brilliant decision to call it the day. It's a poem that's going to live well beyond the specific incidents and that it speaks to. It's a poem of universal power, and yeah, it's one of my very favorites of yours. You can't hear it when we're reading how the poems look on the page, but if I'm not mistaken, that poem has two stanzas.
Yes.
The stanza break between them, and even that feels to me like this leap into what the sentiment of the end of the poem is talking about. You go from all this tragedy to this kind of prayer for basically for to be spared that that horror. And I just love the way that poem appears on the page. And that's again something I really learned from your poems, reading them as a boy, just the importance of how you place poems on the page, which maybe again doesn't come through as well when we're reading, but is something, you said something about me being a craftsman, and I certainly got that from you, and just recognizing the power of where you place a word and how you write a line and how you make decisions regarding stanza breaks and all those little things that poets love to obsess over. Obviously came from my study of your work.
I always love that about Gary Snyder's work, especially the backcountry and his earlier work. And I think it came from his influence in Zen and from the great poets that he studied from other cultures, where the poem was actually almost painted on the page like a piece of artwork. And Snyder's whole analogy of riprap, of placing words like stone along the edge of a creek, each stone placed in to hold the creek bed. You could see how Snyder placed the words on the page like that. So it was very, very powerful. And I always love that too. I love the structuring of the poem that way. And that's something that I really credit him for pointing out to us. So
Yeah,
Austin, when you're writing, and you write in so many different genres, like I said, you've done nonfiction essays that have been nationally published, your multiple volumes of poetry, you're working on a novel, you've had, you won several awards for your short stories. How do you move from genre to genre?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, I think that my first love is always going to be poetry. My first love is always going to be writing poems. But I think one thing that's happened with my not only our family moving away from Illinois and off the farm, but my experiences living in other places is really a desire to kind of recreate the world of my childhood. And I find that fiction is a great opportunity for that. It's a way for me to kind of build out the world. And, if you're a writer, you understand that while you're writing, you're seeing it again. And so poems feel to me like they're kind of given. I'd never, like the morning I woke up to the fog, I didn't expect to write a poem called Fog, but fiction takes maybe a little bit more volition and a little bit more effort for me. I don't think I enjoy it as much, but it's really a process of kind of recreating a vanished time and place. Not that poems can't do that, of course, but that's sort of how I think of it. But again, I mostly read poetry. I mostly read biographies of poets. I think about poetry a lot more than I think about fiction, I think. And so my first love will always be this genre. And I should say, though, my dad has been writing stories lately, and they're incredible. And they have the same quality as his poems do. And they come from the same world and feature a lot of the same kinds of characters. But it's really nice to see you exercising this muscle you have for narrative and storytelling. And so I think it's really, I remember something that the poet Rita Dove told me in graduate school. She said she didn't understand why American writers either choose poetry or fiction as a genre, because she had spent some time in Europe, and she said writers in Europe, they they love to try all these different genres. And she thought it was a failing of American writers, actually, that we don't do that. So I try to encourage my students to explore multiple genres and not feel like you have to be pigeonholed into any one particular one. So,
Right. Excellent
yeah.
point. I know that, when I was farming, I had so limited time to write that the shorter form, the poetry, was more accessible. I was able to do that. I could write down a couple of phrases on on a feed sack while I was running the silo unloader or something like that. Now that I have more time, I'm just starting to kind of dip a toe into that and see where it leads. I've always admired how you can move through so many different genres, each one of them at, such a high level. It's really enjoyable. And I love reading everything that you write. So it's always a pleasure for Cheryl and I to read anything that you write. Maybe I'll read another poem and then you can read. Okay. So when we left the only place I had ever lived, other than a couple years when I was away to college, there's some apprehension in that. So you find a new place. Obviously, you want to find a house that you love, land that you like, and of course, you're always wondering about what neighborhood you're moving into. And we were very lucky in the neighborhood we moved in. This area very beautiful, but we're surrounded by beautiful people that feel the same way as we do about the world. As one of our other sons, Levi, said one time that Cheryl and I had hit the jackpot when it came to neighbors who moved here, and we certainly did. But one of our neighbors, unfortunately, passed away a year ago, and I wrote this poem for him, and it's called "A Farmer Dies in Springtime." Home from the hospital to a bed with a view of the fields, tended by hospice who arrive morning and night like a hired man come to chore. Neighbors stop by, sit bedside, stare into their hands red and cracked from winter. They recall the year of the early frost, flood, or big drought. They avoid talk of the plowing or planting, of the futures for cattle or corn. The tractor, disc, and planter stay locked in the shed with seed bought months ago when the new catalogs arrived, glossy with promise and primed for a year that would not be.
Such a good poem. It's such a great elegy. And I knew him. So yeah, the poem, brings him back to me and in my memory of him. And yeah, I think there's an elegiac tone to a lot of your work, Dad, I think, and to mine as well. There's a way of life that's kind of passing away, and also, of course, people passing away. So I think about that a lot when I'm writing. I think a lot of my poems and stories have to do with maybe people on the verge of losing their farms or their sense of identity or their sense of place. So, and I thought I maybe to follow that, I'll read a poem that I wrote or thought of as I was running. I'm a runner. I was running in northwestern Illinois, where I spent part of the year when I'm not teaching. And there are many kind of derelict rundown farms down there, as there are all over the Midwest. And I just kind of kept passing this one particular farm on my runs, and the sadness of the place and the lives of the people who were still living there, but it looked like they were kind of barely hanging on, really struck me. So the poems that I've been writing lately are unpunctuated, so I apologize if it's a little hard to hear the lines. I'll try to read it so that the meaning comes clear. I also apologize that I'm outside. Our internet here is down, so I don't normally wouldn't normally be sitting here by this tree, but this was the only way I could join us today. So apologies also for the breeze. This poem's called Running Past the Forlorn Farm. The windbreak holds the snow in the arms of its boughs, like a nurse holding up a sheet to give her dying patient some privacy as he undresses. But I see through them to the curtains she has drawn, the only art she practices, so she can sleep away these long afternoon hours and maybe dream of summer. And though he has put the derelict equipment away for winter, I know the tractors stand over pans of drained oil, like men inclined towards melancholy. And despite the swing set's best efforts to pretend it is stable, now that she doesn't come outside anymore, I know the bellied swings are longing for the snow to drift and lift them a little, so they can finally let their chains go slack, like waitresses stepping out of their shoes behind the counter. Maybe the best way to put it is that no matter how many flakes will fall through the netless basketball hoop tonight, myriads more will miss.
I love that line about the netless basketball hoop. That is so consistent with that type of a place.
Yeah. Yeah. So exactly. You could tell people have not been shooting baskets there in a while, so the snow will have to do the shooting for them. But yeah, again, just I always have your poems in mind when I'm writing and kind of thinking about, maybe I'm not even cognizant about what I've learned from you, but it comes through. And kind of reading with you today, I feel like I definitely see the resonance between our work and even the tone and the style with which we move through poems. I think there's a shared way in which we move through the poem from beginning to end. And so anyway, that just is struck me today as we read together.
Well, I know that I benefited greatly from having a Wallace Stegner fellow in the family who's a lecturer at Stanford. So when I was putting together the manuscript for Water's Edge Press to review for Ancestral, Austin was instrumental in helping me organize the poems, putting together the themes, just structuring the manuscript, kind of the mechanics of writing. And I know you spend a lot of time working on that. I think another thing that I've really admired about your work over the years, how you can hold to the sense of place, regardless of where you are. I know in a 1 hour reading, we can't cover the depth of your work, but I think of poems such as the one where the father is carrying his sleeping child through the streets of Barcelona that you observed and wrote such a beautiful poem about. Your poem about Chekhov that appeared in the New Yorker, your poem about standing in line to get into tour Anne Frank's house, the house where Anne Frank had to live those many years, and to witness people's impatience about having to wait too long in line. It's just such a powerful image of anybody having impatience as they were waiting to move into to see where Anne Frank and her family had to live. Those themes of place and family, you have expanded those on an international scale, and I really think that's really, really unique.
Thanks, Dad. That's kind of you to say. And I don't know if I had I guess that when I decided to become, or maybe I didn't decide to, but when I started writing poems, didn't have really a sense of how does one make a life doing that, So I went to graduate school for poetry a couple times, and what it did ultimately was it did allow me to have these experiences that I don't think otherwise I would have had. I got to travel a lot. I got to live in places I don't think I would have naturally gravitated towards, and so it's almost like being a poet kind of made it impossible for me not to have those experiences. I think the course of your life is more settled in the Midwest, and yet on the page and in terms of imagination, there's never a feeling of repetitiveness or claustrophobia. There's just such space in your poems. And that's why they remind me of the poems of the poets that I love, like Ted Kooser, who writes so beautifully about Nebraska. And yet you never feel there's a universality to the poems despite their placedness. So, and as I say, I literally and figuratively am always returning to the Midwest. So I think ultimately it's for both of us our great subject. And I think that there's a sense too that, maybe people underestimate the beauty of the Midwest, or think it's, like I say in my poetry collection, flyover country. And so I'm really proud that you and I are working to bring out all the beauty and the characters and the things that make the Midwest unique and beautiful. I think that's one of the tasks of our poems is to do that.
Yes, I agree completely. Well, we have about 15 minutes left, so why don't we each try to read 2 more poems, because that's what we want to share with people today. It's been a fascinating conversation. I'll lead off with a poem and then you follow, and then we'll switch back and forth, and I'll let you wrap it up with the last one. How'll that be?
Okay, yeah, that sounds good.
Each Christmas, I try to write a poem that has a significant feeling for the year that we've lived in, and share it in the Christmas card with family and friends. And after the last year that we've gone through, I wrote this poem this Christmas and shared it. It's called Some Nights My Father. Some nights my father would walk me out into the darkness between the house and barn to show me Cassiopeia, the Big Dipper, and the North Star. These things a child must know, so that one day, should the world veer suddenly off course, he can walk with his child across the open into the darkness and point to what is constant, illuminating, and true.
I love that tradition of sending a poem at Christmas, and the poems you've written at Christmas time over the years have been particularly poignant and memorable. And yeah, I'm really excited. Feel strange, but I'm just, again, really encourage everyone to try to find a copy of Ancestral when it comes out, because it's not simply it's not a single collection of poems. It's all of your work over your entire poetic career is gathered together into a book of 120 pages or so.
Yeah.
So it's just a fantastic, basically collected poems, and all these themes that we hear in the poem you just read of again, ancestry and fatherhood and sonhood, and the teaching not only of how to farm, but of other lessons of life, passing down knowledge, as you have to me as a poet. All of those things come through in your poems so beautifully. So again, I didn't have a chance to respond earlier when you were thanking me for helping you put the book together. It was such a joy to do that, or to help you with that. Though there wasn't a whole lot of work for me to do, the poems were amazing. And but just thinking about how to order the collection and all those things that we got to talk about together, that was just really fun. And I'm so excited for the collection to come out. So
you were able to bring your 2 brothers, Ryan, who really helped with the design of the cover, and Levi for his reading of the manuscript and bouncing ideas off. So kind of like a family farm, we had a family poetic project, and that warms my heart. Yeah,
and you have an amazing editor and just a really supportive figure in her, and so it's going to be a really beautiful book. I'm super excited for it. I guess I'll read a very short poem. It's a poem that I think came about kind of similar to the first poem I read, The Leaves, and just kind of thinking about a particular word and all the valences of it. So my mom is a great, she's amazing at puns, and I would humbly say so am I. So we come up with a lot of puns together, and this poem kind of operates on just taking a single word, which is the word tend, and thinking about it in a couple different ways. And it's called Men Aging. And it's not necessarily about my dad, I should be clear. Men aging. Men aging need something to tend to, a horse, say, or a garden. Otherwise, they tend to need tending. Anyway.
I love that. Your
Thanks.
poems, regardless of some of your really long poems or some of your very brief poems. I love your haiku poems. Every
Thanks.
different. So, that is,
Yeah.
well, I'll conclude my part of the reading and then I'll have Austin wrap it up with one more poem. I do want to say again, thank you to Nancy and the team at Arcadia Books for hosting this. We look forward to when Austin gets back this summer, being in the store, doing a reading. Hopefully COVID allows us to read in person in Spring Green. Thank you to Dawn Haug and everyone at Water's Edge Press for publishing Ancestral. I look forward to promoting this book with you and hopefully it will be well received. Since this is a father-son reading, I'll conclude with a poem called Father's Day. Father's Day. I watched my father when I was a boy. I watched my father and followed my father all morning through chores, the long morning chores leading into the day's farm work and field work. I watched my father and followed my father, and at high noon, I followed him in to wait behind him at the wash tub in the old farmhouse. He used tough bars of lava soap and a horse bristle brush clean up to his elbows. His sunburnt arms red and hay chaff specked, the hot scrubbing before the cold water rinse of the morning's work, be it cattle or crop, metal or wood. I watched and followed my father all those years, and now years have passed since I touched his hand. I live on land my father never saw, miles and miles from all we knew. Each morning I rise to the barns and fields. These chores I do to keep me sane. Come noon, I am the man at the wash tub, lathering and rinsing, lathering and rinsing. Thank you.
Well, that's such an amazing poem. It reminds me a little of the poem about the anvil with still hammering home. Lathering and rinsing and lathering and rinsing, and the repetition of that phrase, of course, it makes us see that ritual. And I just so admire, I know the poem so well and I've read it so many times, but even just hearing it now, I noticed some different things that I hadn't before. Of all the things you could say about how long it's been since you saw your dad, you choose to say since you touched his hand, which is so appropriate because it's a poem about him washing his hands. So just those little decisions that I'm sure are probably almost subconscious in a way for many of us poets. It's really a pleasure to read someone's work and maybe point out something or recognize something. And I think we do that for one another a lot. It's really a great joy to do that. And
certainly is.
So, yeah. I guess I'll read a poem for my final poem that I wrote not really realizing that it was an elegy. So I just wrote a poem about the process of drying garlic bulbs from the garden. And but then shortly after writing the poem, a really important poet and mentor named Evan Boland, she directed our program at Stanford. Great Irish poet. She passed away in the spring. And I kind of realized, I don't know why, I kind of recognized something of her in the poem. And so I decided to dedicate it to her, even though I didn't write it with her in mind. So this poem is called Drying Garlic, and it's for Evan Boland. I pulled the heads when the internet said to. The two lowest leaves dead, a third beginning to die, like the first loss of feeling that heralds the stroke. While everything you know happened this year was happening, the cloves were turning into bulbs, and they didn't once cross my mind. But today they came up easy, like they'd been waiting for me, through with dirt and darkness. I tied them in bunches of 5 and hung them in the garden shed, where they hang now as I write this, drying in the night air, beginning to put on their thin skins. I want to know everything they learned in the dark. A few weeks, and I will smash them with the flat of a knife. Maybe I'll taste it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Austin. Your mother says wonderful job. So,
Hi, Mom. And my dog, Wendell, is here. He's been very good and hasn't barked at all, but Wendell says hi to my parents' dog, Jax. So, yeah.
On my foot, he says hi. Thank you, Austin.
This has been lovely. Yeah. Thank you, Dad.
Love you. Nancy, we'll turn it back to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
You guys, that was amazing. It was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing. And we see Daniel and Cheryl weekly.
Yeah.
Sometimes more than. But
they tell me that, yeah.
Yeah, to get this insight into your relationship. And I especially love the poem when people pick up a copy of Ancestral, they'll read the poem about the first time Daniel saw Cheryl by the bike rack, and it's so sweet.
Oh, yeah.
I just loved it so
Great
much.
poem.
So
yeah.
yeah, thank you so much. So we're gonna upload this to our YouTube channel for everybody to enjoy. And again, we'll look forward to our event hopefully in June with James Bonin, and who is our resident poetry lover. So we're looking forward to a great event.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Nancy.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Talk to you guys soon. Bye-bye.